Good day and welcome to another episode of Workers' Power. My name is Phakamile Hlubi-Majola, but you can call me Pax. And of course, today is another exciting episode of Workers' Power. And thank you so much for joining us. Today's episode is going to be slightly different. We are right now in the middle of what is possibly one of the greatest global crises in recent history. We are witnessing a genocide on a mass scale against the innocent people of Palestine. As I speak to you now, more than 10,000 people have been murdered by the Israeli government. 73% of those people are women and children. Parents are writing their children's names on their body limbs so that they can be identified in case of a bombing. That is the life of a Palestinian in Gaza today. And this is why we're having this very important show and this very important episode to unpack this very painful situation that's playing itself out in that corner of the world. I am truly excited to be joined by the Deputy General Secretary of the SRWP, yes, Dr. Vashna Jagarnath, who is in studio today. I've been dying to have you on the show, as you know.
Yes.
What some of you perhaps don't know is that Vashna is a historian. And this is actually why we brought her onto the show. And I know we're going to have many collaborations with her because she has this really fantastic way of unpacking history and explaining where we started, where, struggles started. And in the case of today's episode, and because the focus is Palestine and Gaza, we're going to start right there. Welcome to Workers' Power.
Fantastic. I'm so happy to be here. Wonderful.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes.
And we want to start right at the beginning because it's important to have context. So we know what's been happening since October 7th and obviously since before then.
Yeah.
But I'd like you to just take our viewers through where did all of this start?
I think it's important for us to understand where it started, because not just for us to have a sense of the origin of the problem, but also for us to understand how it's playing out today and why it's playing out today, so we can make interventions in the present. I think history is at its most powerful when you use it as a tool to be able to make interventions into the present and use the material reality of our past to change something now for the better. Obviously not for the worse, we don't want that. But the thing about Palestine is Palestine has always been a site of conflict and contestation. And part of it is that it's actually at the center of three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. So it's been an incredibly important site historically. As we all know, two of the major religions of the world were birthed in Palestine. And then the third major religion of the world, Islam, has many holy sites within Palestine. So it's kind of the home of all these three religions, which has impacted in our world for the last 2,000 years in a massive way. So obviously that site of Palestine becomes incredibly important. Also historically, Palestine has been controlled by a variety of people. In ancient times, it was the ancient Egyptian kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. You also had Alexander the Great, who came and controlled Palestine for a period. And you had lots of different people, like the Roman Empire was there, especially we know this when Christ was born, the Roman Empire was there from the Bible. So this is really important. And in the modern times, it's been the Ottoman Empire that's been in charge. And they've been in charge from the 14th century. 15th century, 1400s. And they were in charge for 400 years. However, in World War I, at the outbreak of World War I, the Ottoman Empire sided with the German forces. And they lose. And as they lose World War I, the Ottoman Empire crumbles at the same time. And there's this question about what to do with Palestine, the space, because it's not just Palestine alone, it's Syria, it's Jordan, it's this whole area. What do we do with it? So basically the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations, it forms to deal with World War I. They decide that Britain should control it on behalf of the League of Nations.
I wanted to jump in at that point because there's a lot happening in Europe during World War I. And if you can also unpack that, because all of that has an impact on how we got here today.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, while the Palestinians are now being, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, are being colonized in a way by Britain. It's actually a colonialism, even though they call it a British mandate. What is happening in Europe is, the long problem that Europe has faced is European anti-Semitism. European anti-Semitism goes back 2,000 years. And since Jesus Christ, basically. Yeah. And what has happened is, over periods of time, there have been waves of what's called pogroms. And pogroms are effectively things where non-Jewish communities go out and they go on riots or whatever, and they target Jewish people and Jewish communities. And it often ends in very violent massacring of Jewish people. So it's like a version of how you see xenophobic attacks playing out in our country, but with far worse conditions. And in fact, before World War I, in the late 19th century, from around 1880 to around 1910, in Ukraine itself, what's present-day Ukraine, there were 1,302 pogroms, which people claim killed between 70,000 and 250,000 Jews.
So long before Hitler and Nazism arrives, you've actually got, decades, centuries of attacks on Jews and Judaism in Europe.
Absolutely.
And this is where this is what brings us to where we are today.
And I mean, if you think about Ferdinand and Isabel with the Kingdom of Spain, they have the Spanish Inquisition, and they kill Jews. And what's incredibly important about this is that for all these hundreds of years, when Jews were fleeing the persecutions of Europe, it was the Arab world and North Africa that was the site of refuge for them. They came there. And what is really important is we have to understand that when the British come to take a mandate over Palestine, the people that are living there are people that are made up of this thousands of years of history. They've got Egyptian ancestry, Greek, all of these things. They also are Jewish Arabs, they are Christian Arabs, and they are Muslim Arabs.
So there's a whole melting pot,
exactly,
a whole community. I mean, I've done a bit of research where they speak about how Palestine had a thriving culture because of all of these influences from, different parts of the world.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so as this Jewish problem is unfolding in Europe, leading into World War I, there is a move within the Jewish community, especially in Eastern Europe, to have a sort of revivalist moment, a revivalist politics, where they're beginning to say, oh, well, we now need our own homeland, we need all of this. And for them, the obvious place is Palestine because of the religious connotations, not because those people who are making these claims ever lived in Palestine or are Arabs. So Arab is not a religion. Arab is an ethnicity, and you get Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Arabs. But those people who develop Zionism don't come from that tradition and that history. But they say, they wanted Palestine, but it could have been anywhere. I mean, the other option was Uganda. The other option was Argentina. Exactly. So this then is actually, for me, really important, because what they are doing is they are making a claim to a homeland. It's very similar to what the Afrikaners did when they came here. It's very similar to what the Americans do, the white Europeans, when they go to America. There's the sense that there's what is called terra nullius, empty earth, as if people are not there and we can just take it. And that is a very dangerous narrative, because what that narrative does is it implies there's no one living there, so anyone that's killed doesn't matter. And that discourse is very strong. It stays with us. It's deeply embedded within the colonial discourse. And you see the Zionist movement beginning to use that discourse, claiming it their homeland, therefore nullifying that amazing cosmopolitan community that you just said lived there, nullifying their existence completely. It's like what the European colonizers did all across Africa, Latin America, and the Americas, and what the Afrikaners do later.
So you just dehumanize the local population in order to justify your unlawful takeover of land.
Absolutely.
Doesn't that story sound familiar?
Yes.
And I think this is precisely why we're having this conversation, because those themes are so similar to the themes of colonization and imperialism, which we've actually been trying to fight against. But let's go back again into history. So now you've got this situation where the Jews are making a claim, claiming that this is their homeland, even though they actually have no legitimate claim to it, but nonetheless they've done so. What happens next?
So in Europe, after World War I, there's this idea there won't be any more wars. But there's World War II in a very short space of time, with the rise of Hitler in Germany. And the rise of Hitler in Germany sort of once again pronounces and shines a spotlight on this Jewish question. And we know exactly the ways in which he exterminated, and there was a genocide against the Jews in Europe, run and spearheaded by Hitler, but also a lot of other countries around him got on that bandwagon with him, including Italy and so on, which we forget about. We just talk about Hitler, but there was a whole series of countries. And what begins to happen is now Britain and them in the Allied forces, they're not sure what to do now with this problem. Rather than confront it and confront their own chauvinisms, they then start slowly from the 1920s bringing Zionists into Palestine and creating the settlements. And then by 1936, what begins to happen is the local Palestinian population that's been there, is there, they begin to rebel against A, the British for colonialism, because it is colonialism, but B, against this encroaching settlement of the Zionist communities into Palestine. And what is effectively begins is the Great Palestinian Revolution from 1936 to 1939. And this is really important because it is a very important moment in Palestinian history and in their liberation. But it's smashed effectively, because what the British start doing is they start arming the Zionist groups and creating militias within the Zionist group. And in this period, obviously, World War II is happening. So there's all of this stuff happening in a maelstrom. And by the time the war ends in 1945, Britain no longer wants Palestine. This is like a problem they don't want to deal with. So between the period of 1945 and 1948, there is a lot of breakdown in relations with the British, the Palestinians, and with the Zionist settlers that they put there. But also after World War II, Britain is completely bankrupt. So they get a loan from the United States for $100,000. It's called the Anglo-American loan. And the United States is saying to them, we are not giving you this loan until you don't take that 100,000 Holocaust survivors and resettle them into Palestine.
Was the condition.
And that was the condition of the loan. And so this is what begins to happen. But now Britain says they don't want it. They give it back to the United Nations, the ex-League of Nations, and says, you all deal with this, you all create a pathway. And that's why in 1947, the end of 1947, they create the partition of creating an Israeli state and an Arab state. The Arabs reject this partition, and then begins a 4-month civil war. And the Palestinians are completely decimated in this period. Close to 700,000 people are either dead, have fled country, or have been made dispossessed of their land. Right? And just think about 1913 Land Act, very similar, complete dispossession of people and their land. And that has a massive impact on people's lives. It's a complete destruction of their way of life, their culture, their politics, their autonomy, and any dreams of a sovereign nation is completely smashed and gone. And this is when the Israeli state the Zionist Israeli state comes into being, and this is at the center and the heart of our problem. And while they stick to their partition lines initially, over time, as we know, they encroach and encroach and encroach and take more and more land. And this is at the crux of our problem.
And it's interesting that you're talking about this, because many people are behaving as if what Palestine, or rather specifically what Gaza is enduring since in the last couple of weeks, is a new thing. It's not a new thing. Israel has, for the longest time, been practicing ethnic cleansing, and there's different forms of ethnic cleansing. I mean, you basically unpacking that when you talk about what happened in 1948. It actually started there with the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian people, which is something that continues even today.
Yes, and the ethnic cleansing and the destruction of Palestinian society happens in very real ways. And we in South Africa can really understand it, because it's tied so deeply to our own history. If we think about what 1913 Land Act did to the African family, How did it destroy the African family unit? Because that's followed with migrant labor.
You were stripped of your dignity.
You were stripped of your land. You were stripped of the space that is your home.
Your ability to feed yourself.
Exactly.
For African people, land was wealth.
Yes.
There was no need for them to go into the mines.
They didn't have to go into the capitalist system.
They were actually existing peacefully, taking care of themselves, taking care of their families off the land. And it was when they were forced off the land, when suddenly the need, and it was through various taxes.
Exactly. The hut tax, and all of that. But more importantly, it was removing them off the land meant for the first time they had to enter the wage market, which they never had to before that. But in Palestine, they do it so that they render them insecure. And Palestinians have been insecure in being able to reproduce themselves. By this, I mean, they don't have access to education. They don't have access to land. They don't have access to water. They don't have access to electricity. The Israeli state determines it. And while that might not be a big, massive, as horrendous as it is, war that is happening now on the Palestinian people, it is still a way to undo Palestinian people. It's still a way to lessen their humanity. It's still a way to deprive them of humanity and in that way destroy them.
And it's violent.
Absolutely violent.
I think we cannot underestimate the levels of violence that the Israeli state has imposed on the people of Palestine. When you think about, and I think can we also talk about this issue of this description of Israel as an apartheid state. The fact that Israel has built what they call the biggest open-air prison in the world.
No, absolutely. I mean, what you see with Israel echoes very similarly to what happened to the Afrikaners in the Anglo-Boer War, when the English had created concentration camps to put the Afrikaner community in. And when that war is over, they say, never again will this happen to us. In the same way, the Zionists will say, never again will the oppression we faced. And they use the oppression of the Holocaust to say, never again will this happen to us. And that gives them a lot of political and cultural power, because what happened during the Holocaust was horrendous and should be condemned every single day. But that does not give you the right, when you are oppressed, to turn into an oppressor. And this is what happens. And they use very similar mechanisms to the apartheid state. And by the way, they take a lot of the technologies that were invented by the apartheid state and use it in Israel to control Palestinians. Stuff like identity documents, fingerprinting, which we are the world experts in because we wanted to control the black population so much. That's all was imported into Israel to deal with their people. But I think, I mean, apartheid was horrendous and extreme. But what has happened and what has happened to the Palestinian people is on such a bigger scale. It's so much more final, like building a wall to actually separate you. It's actually like apartheid gone to the most extreme level.
It's apartheid on steroids.
Yes, exactly.
And I think it's also important to divorce or to be very clear that by condemning Israel and branding it as an apartheid state, this is not the same thing as condemning Jewish people. I think one of the things that I've seen a lot of on social media, in the news, is how there have been many, many, many progressive Jewish people, Jewish communities that are deeply aggrieved about what's happening, that are, virulently in objection to Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli state and what they're doing to Palestine.
No, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the history of Palestine in 1948, when the Nakba happens, is effectively made up of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. You get Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Palestinians. All of those people are displaced by the Zionist state. What we have to understand is Zionism is one thread of Judaism. It's a reformist Judaism. It's one thread of it. There's different threads. You have Orthodox Judaism, you have Hasidic Jews, you have all types of different beliefs. Just as how in Christianity you have Protestantism, Catholics, charismatic Christians, all of these different threads. It's the same thing. Now imagine if you were in a situation where, like for example, when Donald Trump takes over the United States, he's into that charismatic Christianity thing, and that's his sort of audience. if now we start saying all Christians are a problem, we know that's not true. We know it's not a Christian problem. We know it's a Donald Trump and his particular line of politics that ties to a particular version of Christianity that's a problem. And so that is why we continuously have to say the Zionist Israeli state. We must never ever say Jews, because that in itself is an anti-Semitic rhetoric, and actually, importantly, it feeds in to the Zionists discourse. They say, oh, y'all are being anti-Semitic. So it actually gives them ammunition, right? And we need to continuously be aware of that. And it's actually just empirically not true. That's why it shouldn't be done.
Yeah. So I want us just to go also, as we unpack this issue, just to touch a little bit on some of the cultural significance of some of these, you know, for example, there's the Palestinian scarf, which is now extremely popular for obvious reasons. Could you talk to us briefly about some of these symbols of the Palestinian struggle and why they're important?
I think, you know, symbols and cultural work of struggle is incredibly important. And when you think about how the Israeli state, the effort the Israeli state has made in dehumanizing Palestinians, like the effort the apartheid state made in dehumanizing Africans and black people in general, the effort that white people in America made to dehumanize African slaves. And yet from those places, amazing cultural work comes up. It shows you the resilient spirit of humanity. And that's an amazing spirit that the Palestinians have. And there's three really key fundamental cultural things that foundational to Palestinian identity. And one is the keffiyeh, which is the Palestinian scarf. And that actually becomes popular in that Palestinian revolution of 1936. And it is used, there's a call for people to start using it to assert an Arab identity, a pan-Arab identity. And then what you have is, the other thing that's really important is the Nakba. The Nakba is that moment in 1948 when there's like a mass dispossession of Arab people.
Yes, you hear Palestinians talking about the Nakba
all the time. And now they're saying this is like almost a second Nakba that's happening to them. And what's important about the Nakba is the key. The key becomes the symbol of the Nakba, because people actually literally take their key thinking they're going to come back to their house. And often you see Palestinians, old Palestinians, walking to where their house is, but it's occupied now by some settler. And they have the key for that house, but they can't go into it. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And then the other sort of really key post-1948 symbol is Handala, which is a cartoon done by Naji Ali. And Naji Ali had to leave Palestine when he was 10 years old. And the importance of this cartoon is that the figure Handala is 10 years old. And I want to read to you what Ali writes. He says, Handala was born 10 years old, and he will always be 10 years old. It was the age that I left my homeland. When Handala returns, he will still be 10 years old. And only then will he start growing up.
So it's like he's frozen in time.
Exactly.
Until he can be free.
Yes. And this is the condition of the refugee. This is the condition of people who are dispossessed. You are frozen in time. And if we think about it, if we think about how we are frozen in time as black people, as colonized people, we are always frozen in time. This happens in all sorts of ways. If we in South Africa have Cultural Day, or Heritage Day. And we're also excited to put on our heritage. And then we go and put on things that come from the moment the colonizer encountered us. We are wearing that clothing. Why? Because they froze us in that time. Why are white South Africans not wearing the stuff of Czech Boers? Because we are effectively wearing that clothing. I must wear a sari that comes from that period. Like, that's what I would wear. And that clothing is a frozen in time moment. We all get frozen in time because it renders us out of the modern, and it renders us childlike. And that becomes your condition, and therefore you get treated in those ways. And it's incredibly disconcerting because you know your full humanity, but you're not able to assert it. You think about, why do they say garden boy? Why is it a boy when it's a grown man? It's this freezing of people and infantilization of actual adults.
Because at the end of the day, you're dehumanizing them.
Yes.
So in order to dehumanize them, you must always reduce them.
Exactly.
And in reducing them, you don't have to, they're not equal to you. They're not as human as you, and therefore not deserving of full rights.
Absolutely.
And I think so much of that has been expressed by members of the Israeli Defense Force and other members of the governing elite in Israel, where they, for example, have described, I think it was Benjamin Netanyahu himself, who described them as, human animals. when you call a human being a human animal, what is it that you're conjuring up in the minds of the people? You are effectively denying that person their full humanity, and you are justifying any kind of violence
against them
because they're not like you, and therefore they don't deserve to be protected, defended. You know, you'll hear members of the Israeli Defense Force saying that there were no civilians killed. You know, in Palestine, because to them these are not people, these are not human beings. And so I just want to use that to also bring us into this conversation around the relationship between anti-colonialism struggles, anti-imperialism struggles, and Palestine.
I think this is absolutely important because at the heart of the rhetoric of the Zionist state is a colonial rhetoric. And this is why they are colonizers. They have occupied a place. And it's right to call the people who go there settlers, because it's exactly like how we call people settlers here. They're a settler colonial power. And it's not this internal colonialism debate, no, because they come in 1948. They weren't there before that. And that's the moment they take it over. In 1948, they come and they just take it over. They don't have, like in South Africa, for example, a 200-year history of people living, becoming, you know, different communities, amalgamating, growing, whatever. And then in 1948, you have the apartheid state. You don't have, it's not that. It's completely, the moment they arrive, they take control, and they are absolutely an occupying force. And it's colonization. And this is why to deal with the Palestinian question is not just about Palestinians. And obviously right now, it's the urgent demand is for a ceasefire, and then the sort of removal of the occupiers from Palestine. Right? The end of occupation of Palestine has to be there, and has to be final and soon. But what you also have to be tied to this, and this is why it's important for all of us to understand this, is this deep question of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. Because what's happening in Palestine is happening all over the global south. It's happening all over our continent. What the Palestinians go through, we go through all the time. And the Palestinians have gone through it as well. Hence our close links and understanding of their condition. Obviously for them it's more extreme. But, you know, we don't, with all the American bases that have now been put across Africa, what happens to those countries' sovereignty? Like the Palestinians, they have very little right to determine their own nation's well-being, right? We have it through economic policies that are imposed on us by the World Bank structural adjustment programs, where we can't decide on whether we have good schools or not. And hence we don't have decent education. We don't have access to water and electricity on a continuous basis. There's massive amounts of food insecurity. There's a massive amount of violence that's put in place every day on this African continent to keep the population in control. And so I think for us, as we face our struggles every day, we need to begin to think about the Palestinians and ourselves as deeply linked. And this is the only way we can do that, because then we create a broad movement of people who, if you undo imperialism and colonialism, you will undo what the Palestinians are facing.
Can we also talk about some of the methods of solidarity that we can use in order to advance the agenda of the Palestinian people?
I think firstly, very key, this method of solidarity that we employ. I mean, we all are doing things in whatever way we can right now because we just have to, you know. But I think the situation is so dire. But I think we need to really also sit down and plan as we are running with this. We still need to plan and think about what it is we want to come out of this. Because protest, okay, I go protest on Saturday. Then what? That's just the event. We need to look at these protests. We need to look at this moment that we are building solidarity and think about what we're going to do with it. How is it important? The reason why we so instinctively on the side of Palestine, because Palestine stood with us against the anti-apartheid struggle. So out of that international protests, those strong relations and bonds were built between us and the Palestinians. And that is a long-term effect. So we need to think about those things. And I really think one of the key ways we can do this, when international solidarity is at its best, is when it's embedded in mass and working class movements. It cannot be determined by individuals. It cannot be determined by NGO groups. NGO groups need to come and work in solidarity with workers. And this is a very easy thing. People in Gaza, in Palestine, face high rates of unemployment. In Gaza, over 50% of the population is unemployed. When the working class are protesting against unemployment, the working class itself must put Palestine at the forefront alongside our issues, and those that work on Palestinian issues must join us in those protests and be in solidarity with us, and we will be in solidarity with them. And that's how you build a bigger consensus. You can't just every time there's, now once again Palestine's in the news cycle. Every day Palestinians are suffering. These attacks and this war on the Palestinian people's absolutely horrendous. But before the 7th of October, life wasn't great for people in Gaza either. In 2021, there was a UN study that said that Gaza won't be able to actually feed itself in 2021, and that was what was happening. So we need to build continuous solidarity. We need to build continuous education programs. We need to do the work. And we in the labor movement, we in trade unions have a lot of power. We have a lot of ways in which we can act. And I think that's absolutely fundamental. We need to use this moment of solidarity that we can build around the issue of Palestine to deal with the Palestine issue, but also very importantly for us to come together in order to build a larger anti-imperialist, anti-colonial project that can change the current world order. I think that's absolutely vital.
And on that note, we must end this discussion. And I think, before we, fully close off the show, one of the calls that has been made by organizations and trade unions in Palestine is for unions to take direct action in terms of not assisting Israel in any way when it comes to arming itself. These are debates that union members must have, resolutions that they hopefully should adopt in terms of a program of action. But it falls into the many activities that we can embark on in defense of Palestine. We want to thank you so much, Dr. Vashna Jagarnath, for being with us today. We really enjoyed this engagement, and we look forward to seeing you again. And of course, to those of you at home, subscribe, like and subscribe to Workers' Power, and please definitely give us your comments on the show. And that's it for today.
Socialist.